Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip, fix your keystone. Happens all the time. You spend hours prepping for the presentation and practicing and building your content, doing your outlines and getting it just right. And then you spend hours building your slides. You look for the right pictures, you figure out the right way to use text, you get the visuals just right on your slides. But when it goes up on the screen, it just doesn't look right. Instead of the pretty rectangle you had planned on, you're stuck with a trapezoid, and the bottom of your image is narrower than the top. You've got a keystone issue. In old construction, the keystone would typically be the stone at the top in the center of an arch. That stone kept the left side from collapsing into the right side. It typically had a trapezoidal shape so that it could actually support the arch and would just sort of plug in up top. It's a critical piece of that structure. In a projected image, though, it's a problem. You see, keystone problems exist because of data projectors. When you tilt a projector up slightly by raising the front of it, you change the screen geometry because the top of the projector lens is now just a fraction of an inch further away from the screen than the bottom of the lens. So, to fix it, look for keystone correction options in the settings of the projector. Some projectors will do it automatically. Others, you'll have to use those buttons to manually adjust it. And of course, if you then change your projector angle, you'll have to redo your keystone correction. Keystone issues are becoming less common as more speakers use LCD or TV panels for their presentations instead of using data projectors. But as long as projectors are still out there, this is one more reason to get to your event early so you can adjust things to give you the best opportunity for success. Stick around, and after the break, I'll talk about Nancy Duarte's book, Resonate. Welcome back. In November of 1940, a newly opened suspension bridge in Tacoma, Washington, collapsed. The wind blew and the bridge vibrated. The vibrations grew stronger and turned into waves. The road deck rose and fell and twisted in ever larger amounts until it finally tore itself apart and collapsed into the waters of the Puget Sound. Many textbooks and cable channel disaster shows use this as an example of resonance. Now, engineers and physicists might take issue with that specific use of the term, but the concept applies. Forces that hit the right frequency with an object will resonate with it and can multiply their effects to seemingly impossible levels. Resonance is about much more than just tearing things apart, though. It's about finding just the right way to maximize an impact, to take a small force and to make it a larger one. When your presentation resonates with your audience, when you and they are on just the right frequency together, you feel it. The air in the room is almost electric. It's a feeling that professional speakers thrive on and crave again and again, and it builds on itself even further. Nancy Duarte's book, Resonate, talks about how to do that in presentations by connecting with your audience through storytelling. She focuses on how the most effective speeches and presentations use a story structure around contrast, about acknowledging where the audience is today and showing them where they could be tomorrow. And that's what I'll be covering in more depth this week. First, I'll share some general thoughts about the physical book itself, and then I'll look at 10 passages that jumped out at me and why I think they're important. First, let's talk about the book. Physically, it's a big book, or rather, it's an odd-shaped book. Not in terms of just the thickness and number of pages, but in terms of its length and width. It's almost square, actually. It will take up more space than many other books on your shelf. But it's not just filled with content, it's also filled with design. Often the content will be on the left-hand page, and the right-hand page, when you're looking at it, will be a full bleed image, or maybe with a quote, or it will feature a graphic explaining a concept and detailing the content that was on the left-hand side, or a chart that explores that content in greater depth. The book covers discrete topics on each page generally. If you were teaching a class, you could almost use each turn of a page as a lesson in the concepts that Duarte is sharing. Sometimes graphics explain the text, and sometimes the text itself becomes the graphic. So I'm not sure how well this book would translate into a Kindle or other ebook format. Often a book itself is just a container for the content on those pages. In this case, though, the book itself is part of the content. So it's definitely worth taking a look at. Now, I'll take a look at some key passages. Many of them talk about the themes I frequently talk about in the podcast, and it's always nice to see even more external validation of the ideas I share. I hope that the passages from resonate with you like they do with me. Passage 1. Language and power are inextricably linked. The spoken word pushes ideas out of someone's head and into the open so humankind can contend with adopting or rejecting its validity. Moving an idea from its inception to adoption is hard, but it's a battle that can be won simply by wielding a great presentation. Presentations are a powerful tool, and when packaged in a story framework, your ideas become downright unstoppable. Story structures have been employed for hundreds of generations. What I like about this passage is that she's already talking about how important language is. It doesn't matter if you have a great idea in your head if you don't share it with the world. If you don't share it with others, then nobody can go ahead and act on your idea, can act on your vision, and can make the world a better place. And a key part of those presentations isn't just sharing the sheer facts of that idea, but it's about putting it into that story, building that story in a way that is going to connect with the audience, as we've seen time and again. It all comes down to storytelling to share your ideas. Building on that idea of having an impact is passage number 2. You'll notice that change is a theme throughout the book. Most presentations are delivered to persuade people to change. All presentations have a component of persuasion to them. This notion may ruffle some feathers, but isn't there usually a desired outcome from what's classified as an informative presentation? Yes. You're moving your audience from being uninformed to being informed, from being uninterested in your subject to being interested, from being stuck in a process to being unstuck. Many times the audience needs to do something with the information you're conveying, which makes your presentation persuasive. So whether you're an engineer, teacher, scientist, executive, manager, politician, or student, presentations will play a role in shaping your future. The future isn't just a place you'll go, it's a place you will invent. Your ability to shape your future depends on how well you communicate where you want to be when you get there. What I like about this passage is the idea of that call to change. I talk a lot about the importance of having a call to action, of understanding what you want your audience to do with the presentation that you are conducting, what you want them to do with that information. And maybe that action you want them to take is just to be more aware, or to rethink some concepts, or to actually push a plan forward. But anytime you're building a presentation, whether it's just an informative briefing or whether it's a opportunity to implement a new policy, you need to be able to tell your audience what you want them to do, and you need to make sure that your stories and your content are powerful enough to persuade them to go ahead and do that. Passage number 3 says, there's a difference between being convinced with logic and believing with personal conviction. Your audience may agree with the thought process you present, but they still might not respond to the call. People rarely act by reason alone. You need to tap into other deeply seated desires and beliefs in order to be persuasive. You need a small thorn that is sharper than fact to prick their hearts. That thorn is emotion. And then Duarte goes ahead and quotes Seth Godin, who says, the problem is this. No spreadsheet, no bibliography, and no list of resources is sufficient proof to someone who chooses not to believe. The skeptic will always find a reason, even if it's one the rest of us don't think is a good one. Relying too much on proof distracts you from the real mission, which is emotional connection. What I like about this passage is that Duarte talks about one of the other themes that I talk about a lot, and that of connecting with your audience emotionally. A few weeks back, I talked about the importance of ethos, pathos, and logos, and how you have to have the balance of them all in a presentation to actually move an audience, to actually connect with the audience, to actually get what you want. You can't just rely on a list of facts, just like a salesperson can't just rely on a list of features to sell a product or a service. You have to go beyond those features. You have to go to the benefits. You have to go to the benefit for the audience, help them understand what's in it for them, both at a logical level and then at that deeper internal level of emotion. You want to find a way to evoke that passion, evoke that connection, to be able to help the audience resonate with the material that you are talking about so you can build that bigger force. Earlier this year, I talked about the different roles of PowerPoint in an earlier episode of the podcast, and Duarte weighs in on this as well in passage 4. She says, "It's become the cultural norm to write presentations as reports instead of stories. But presentations are not reports. Many people who create presentations are stuck in the mindset that if they use a presentation application like PowerPoint to create a report, the report is a presentation. It is not. Reports should be distributed. Presentations should be presented. Documents masquerade as presentations, and these slide-uments have become the lingua franca of many organizations. While documents and reports are very valuable, they do not need to be projected for the purpose of hosting a read-along. One of the things that I coach presenters on is not to refer to a slide deck or a PowerPoint file as a presentation. People in corporate offices often ask, can you send me that presentation? The answer is no. You cannot send somebody a presentation. You can send somebody the slides. You can send someone the PowerPoint file. You can send somebody the deck, but you can't send the presentation because a presentation exists at a specific point in time and space. It is an experience between the presenter and the audience. PowerPoint is a great tool, but it is often misused. Many people refer to death by PowerPoint and talk about how much they hate PowerPoint because they're seeing people use PowerPoint wrong. They're seeing people prepare reports and put them into PowerPoint slide formats that are intended to be read at their desk, not presented from a stage. If you're going to be presenting from a stage, make sure your slides have no font smaller than 25 point. Minimize the text on your slides. Go with full images. If somebody can read your slides and know everything about your presentation, that is not a deck for use during your presentation. There's too much stuff on those slides. Remember, during your presentation, your slide deck, your PowerPoint file is there just to support you. You are still the main focus of that presentation. You are still the main focus for the audience. And that's why your slides can have fewer words. You don't need the sub-bullets on your slides you're using when you're doing a live presentation. Just the main ones. You can speak the rest of the content. You can explain the rest of the content. And if you have a spreadsheet in your slides and people in the back of the room can't read that content, or even if people in the front of the room can't read that content, that is a terrible slide. Anything that's illegible on a slide means that that should not be there at all. Maybe it's great when you read it at the desk, but if it's illegible when presented, there's no point in having it there. So save those slide documents for reports that you're going to email around the office or share through a cloud drive. But when it comes to doing actual live presentation, use slides specifically built for live presentation. And Duarte puts a lot of emphasis on understanding the audience because understanding the audience is one of the things that's important to relating to them. In passage number 5, she says, keep answering the questions until you move away from what your audience members do for a job and begin to acquaint yourself with who they are as people. You can imagine their childhood. What games did they play? What was home life like? What TV shows shaped their psyche? anything that will generate a connection. Your goal is to figure out what your audience cares about and link it to your idea. The more you can tie into what your audience has already experienced, the more likely they are to relate to you, the more likely your presentation is to resonate with them. Make sure that the stories that you tell will connect with your audience. Understand who they are and what they care about, because when you understand that, you are better able to refine your message and choose just the right stories that are going to work best for you in that situation. Last week I talked about structure and having a plan for where you want to go. And that's part of the early development process of a presentation. Where do you want to take your audience? Duarte talks about that as well. In passage number 6, she says, presentations should have a destination. If you don't map out where you want the audience to be when they leave your presentation, the audience won't get there. If a sailor wanted to travel to Hawaii, he wouldn't hop in the boat, open the sails, guess at a direction, and fully expect to arrive after a few days of sailing. It simply doesn't work that way. You have to set a course, and that means developing the right content. The destination you define can serve as a guide. Every bit of content you share should propel the audience toward that destination. And this is so important. You want to have your call to action defined. You want to know your goals. You want to know why you're speaking first, and then make sure that everything that you are talking about during that session supports that goal. Have that destination in mind, and then figure out how you're going to go ahead and get there, and how you're going to take the audience to that destination with you. In passage number 7, Duarte says, trying to persuade by stating features and specifications of your subject matter, product, or philosophy is meaningless until you add a human to the mix. Take something like a medical device. The device may be lovely and the alloy strong, but the attribute that creates meaning is that it saves lives. Could there be a story to tell about how the device is used to save a life, or even a doctor's time? Features become valuable when they impact a human. That's where meaning lies. Stories help an audience visualize what you do or what you believe. They make others' hearts more pliable. Sharing experiences in the form of a story creates a shared experience and a visceral connection. Again, going through just details and feature lists and specification lists doesn't sell anything, whether it's a product, a service, or just an idea. You have to go beyond that. You have to tell the audience what's in it for them. You have to make that connection, not just logically, not just in the logos, but also in the ethos and in the pathos. Establish that credibility and establish that emotional connection. Talk to them about how what you are doing is going to help them make a difference in their personal lives, their work lives, or even in the world at large. Another thing I talk about a lot is the importance of finishing on time. And last week, we also talked about cutting extraneous content, anything that gets in the way of what you want to do. Duarte talks about that as well. She says in passage number 8, make edits on behalf of your audience. They don't want everything. It's your job to be severe in your cuts. Let go of ideas, even if you love them, for the sake of making the presentation better. Audiences are screaming, make it clear, not cram more in. You won't often hear an audience member say, that presentation would have been so much better if it were longer. Striking a balance between withholding and communicating information is what separates the great presenters from the rest. The quality depends just as much on what you choose to remove as what you choose to include. You know, I've long felt that one of the most underappreciated roles in the Hollywood system when we look at movies is the editor, is the one who actually goes ahead and has to cut things and can choose what pieces to go in and what pieces to stay in to help the director meet their vision, and most importantly, what pieces to cut out. in your presentation, if your material isn't moving you towards your goal, isn't bringing your audience towards the destination you want, isn't going to make that difference, if your piece of information doesn't have a clear what's in it for them or why bring that up, then it shouldn't be there. Go ahead and cut it. They don't want more content. They want clearer content. Another key aspect of making content clear is being aware of your jargon. I think most folks feel they have a unique language within their specialty, whether that's the technology space, whether that's an aspect of business, whether it's specifically to finance or legal or marketing. We have all these different terms and all these different three-letter abbreviations and more. An outsider can have a very difficult time penetrating all of that. And that stuff is fine when everybody you are talking to understands all of the language that you're using and all of the specific terms that you're using. Unfortunately, you can't always count on that being the case. And if you guess wrong and use jargon that is not universally accessible to your audience, then there's not much point in your presentation. Duarte says in passage number 9, jargon isn't confined to specialized professions. Many good ideas die because they fail to navigate the very organization from which they originate. Different departments within the same entity often use different languages, which can create internal confusion. In some meetings, more acronyms are spoken than real words. An audience will not adopt your idea unless they understand it. Your idea's perceived value will be judged not so much on the idea itself, but on how well you can communicate it. And what I like there is that, again, it's emphasizing just how important it is to communicate clearly. And of course, with all of this great work going into communicating more clearly, telling stories, connecting emotionally with your audience, understanding who they are, all of that does take work. It's not going to be a fast process. You have to do the work. You have to prepare. You have to work hard to make sure that what goes into your final presentation is what needs to be in there. As Duarte says in passage number 10, one thing that will help you remain brief is to put your own constraint on the amount of time you present. Imposing a shorter time frame requires you to be succinct. If they give you an hour, target a talk at 40 minutes. Restriction of time forces clear structure and a filtering down process that leaves only imperative messages. And then Duarte goes on to quote President Woodrow Wilson, who said, "If I am to speak for 10 minutes, I need a week for preparation. If 15 minutes, 3 days. If half an hour, 2 days. If an hour, I am ready now." See, what Duarte and the president were talking about is that it is so much easier to just put out a ton of stuff. You have to go ahead and spend the time to cut, to reduce, to make sure you're getting only the essential stuff. When I started preparing this particular episode, I started with about 35 or 40 different passages from Duarte's book, and I went through and I pruned them and cut them and reduced them, and spent hours just going through and revising the content so I could make sure that I got to the ones that I wanted to focus on the most. That kind of prep work has to go into every presentation that you do in order to maximize your effectiveness. There's a lot of great stuff in Duarte's Resonate. I'd encourage you to go ahead and pick up a copy of the book. You can actually find a link to Resonate on Amazon at 2minutetalktips.com and episode 38, and that will be my affiliate link. I'm Bill Monroe, and until next week, read Resonate, check your screen geography for trapezoids, subscribe to 2 Minute Talk Tips in your favorite podcast app, and don't get best, get better.